The sun was a low, molten coin sliding toward the rim of the horizon, casting the land in that peculiar hour where the shadows grow long enough to whisper. Jonah Creed rode through it without hurry, though his horse's breath steamed in the cooling air. Dust clung to the cuffs of his trousers, to the creases of his weathered coat, as if the earth itself meant to weigh him down. He could smell the day's heat fading, sagebrush cooling, drywood giving back its stored sun. Somewhere ahead the job waited. The clearing was as he'd been told, quiet, half-forgotten, ringed by mesquite that had seen too many years. In the center stood the tree. And bound to it, wrists roped cruelly behind her, was the Apache girl. She was younger than he'd expected, though not a child, her age worn plain in the fine bones of her face. The wind had braided her hair into knots the color of river silt. She did not turn her head at the sound of his arrival. Jonah swung down from the saddle, the leather creaking, the revolver already loose in his hand. She remained still, her breathing even, though the raw skin at her wrists told of hours, maybe days, spent straining against the rope. He stepped closer, the ground crunching under his boots, and the metallic taste of the moment settled on his tongue. They said it'd be quick, he muttered, not sure if he meant it for her or himself. His voice sounded wrong here, as though it belonged to a different man in a different place. Her gaze lifted to meet his, dark, still, and wholly unafraid. It pinned him harder than any bullet could. She didn't beg. She didn't curse. She simply looked at him as if trying to read something on his face that might tell her which way the world would tilt next. Then, without hurry, a tear gathered in the corner of her eye and slipped down her cheek. Not the messy tears of panic, but the slow kind, the kind that slid down the face of someone who had long ago decided they wouldn't give the world that satisfaction. Jonah's grip on the revolver shifted. Somewhere in his mind, Ezekiel's voice replayed, "Clean job. In and out. Nobody to ask questions." But the hinge in Jonah's chest, rusted shut for years, groaned open in that moment. He found himself lowering the gun, though not his guard. "You know why I'm here?" he said. Her lips moved into something that was not quite a smile. "They sent you to finish me." He didn't answer, but silence can be its own confession. She turned her head slightly toward the fading light. "Then why are you still standing there?" The wind pulled at the edges of his coat. He took the knife from his belt and her shoulders tensed, but when he set the blade against the rope, the only sound was the fibers straining before they snapped. She swayed forward. He caught her by the elbow without thinking, feeling the tremor in her muscles. She wrenched her arm free, but she did not run. "They'll send another," she said. "The silver's already been paid." He knew it was true. Her late husband's kin had never forgiven her for outliving him, for keeping the small patch of land that should have reverted to them. Money had bought him here, it would buy the next man too. He took the canteen from his saddlebag, offered it to her. She hesitated before drinking, the water darkening her lips, a small rivulet escaping down her chin. The desert air lifted strands of her hair, revealing faint bruises beneath the curve of her jaw. Somewhere in the distance, a rifle cracked. Jonah's head turned toward the sound. The echo rolled over the land like a warning. A second shot followed, closer. Ezekiel was not a man to wait politely for word. Jonah's decision was made before his mind caught up. He grabbed her wrist, not rough but insistent, and pulled her toward his horse. She resisted for 2 steps, then matched his stride. In the next heartbeat, they were riding hard, the horizon stretching out ahead in a smear of dust and dying light. He knew the trail to his cabin by memory alone, a narrow cut through stone and brush that would hide them from view. The hooves struck sparks from the occasional patch of rock, and the wind burned the edges of his vision. Behind them, the gunfire ceased, but he didn't trust the silence. By the time the cabin came into view, a squat shadow pressed against the canyon wall, the stars had begun to gather in the deepening sky. He swung down, offered her his hand to dismount. She ignored it, sliding down on her own. Her legs nearly gave way, but she caught herself, walking toward the cabin without waiting for him to lead. Inside he lit the oil lamp. The light revealed a space stripped of softness, wooden table, iron stove, a single bed against the far wall. He took the blanket from the bed and draped it over her shoulders. She sat near the stove, hands extended toward the heat, and for the first time he saw the scars on her palms. They were old, white against her skin, but they told their own story. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. In the quiet, the fire crackled, the scent of burning pine filling the space. After a time she spoke. "I was 16 when I married him. Thought I was stepping into a life. Instead I stepped into a house full of locked doors. He died 2 winters ago. I thought maybe that would free me." Her eyes stayed on the fire. But some cages stay even when the door's gone. Jonah found himself watching the way the light caught in her hair, the stubborn lift of her chin. He thought of his sister, of the marks she'd carried, of the night he'd been too far to come in time. He wondered if some ghosts had been riding beside him ever since. Outside, the night deepened, and with it came the faint, distant echo of hoofbeats. He rose without a word, took his gun from the table, and stepped into the cold air. 3 riders approached, shadows against the silvered land. Ezekiel was in front, hat tipped back, the easy grin of a man holding all the cards. "You had one job, Creed," he called. Jonah's stance didn't change. The revolver hung at his side, loose but ready. He glanced toward the cabin, saw Ayanna in the doorway, the blanket still over her shoulders. Something in him settled, like a stone at the bottom of a river. "Job's changed," he said. Ezekiel's grin thinned. The men behind him shifted in their saddles, hands brushing rifle stocks. The moment stretched, the air sharp enough to cut. Jonah could hear the slow, measured breaths of his horse behind him. At last, Ezekiel spat into the dirt. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered, turning his horse. The others followed. Their shapes melted into the night, the sound of hooves fading until it was swallowed by the dark. Jonah stayed there a long while until the night was quiet again. When he turned back, Ayanna had stepped inside, letting the door fall closed behind her. In the days that followed, they kept to the cabin. He went to town only when necessary, aware of the eyes that tracked him, of Ruth Voss watching from her window, lips pressed thin. Stories bloomed in that dry soil, they always did. But he did not hide, and Ayanna did not bow her head. When spring came, they rode into town together. Not as captive and captor, but as something unnamed, something that lived in the pauses between words. In time they married, not for safety, but because the silence between them had filled with trust, with the unspoken knowledge of what they had chosen not to do that day in the clearing. Years later, when asked about the day they met, Jonah would only say, "Sometimes a man comes to end something and finds the start of something else instead." And if his voice carried a weight no one could name, well, that was just the way of things in the West. And sometimes, when the wind came low through the canyon, carrying the smell of mesquite and pine, they would both remember the way the sun had set that eve.